My name is Nora Whitfield. Not born Whitfield. I came to the name at 27 years old in a small Lutheran church on a Saturday morning in October, standing beside a man who smelled like engine grease and fresh hay, and had the kind of hands that fix things without being asked. I wore my mother's dress, altered at the waist. I said the words clearly enough that the minister smiled. I meant every one of them. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. That was 38 years ago. For 38 years I cooked, cleaned, planted, mended, nursed, and kept the calendar of a family that had a very clear idea of what I was for. I buried my husband 2 years before this story begins. I sat by his father's side through the last year of his life, managing his medications and his meals and the kind of steady presence that old men need when they are going away. I did these things without complaint and without asking to be thanked, which is how I was raised, and which is, I have come to understand, exactly the wrong way to move through a family that mistakes your silence for agreement. In March of this year, I sat in an attorney's office in Knox County, Ohio, and listened to the reading of Edmund Whitfield's last will and testament. When the attorney reached my portion and read it aloud, Raymond Whitfield laughed. If this story is already doing something to you, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. I promise you this is only the beginning. Raymond's laugh had the quality of something that had been building for a long time, and had finally found its moment. It was short, definitive, satisfied. He looked across the conference table at me and he said, with the easy authority of a man whose family has always arranged itself around him, "Well, Nora, enjoy your swamp." Claudette pressed her lips together in a way that was nearly a smile. Gerald studied the table in front of him. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my face the way my mother had taught me to keep it in rooms where other people held the power. Still, clear, giving nothing. 3 days later, Raymond was at my door. But before I tell you what brought Raymond Whitfield to knock on a door he had spent 38 years pretending I did not live behind, I have to take you back. All the way back. Because the back of this story is where everything that matters is stored, and I cannot get to the end of it honestly without walking through it first. I grew up in Coshocton, Ohio, which sits at the confluence of 3 rivers and has the gray, patient character of small Midwestern towns that have been waiting a long time for the economy to remember them. My father was a carpenter. My mother worked the counter at the hardware store on 2nd Street for 22 years, and she knew the price of every fastener in the building and could tell you the difference between a sinker nail and a box nail by feel in the dark. I helped in the store after school from the time I was 11 years old. By 14 I could price a lumber load faster than most of the men who came in to buy it. We were not poor exactly, but we understood money the way you understand anything you do not have enough of, with careful attention, without waste, and without the expectation that more would arrive from anywhere other than your own effort. My parents did not complain about this. They considered it normal, and they were right to, and they raised me to consider it the same way. There are worse things to inherit from your parents than a tolerance for work and an accurate understanding of what things actually cost. I met Daniel Whitfield at the Knox County Fair in the August of 1984. He was standing at the rail of the draft horse ring, his arms folded over the top, his hat pushed back on his forehead, watching the Belgians move through their paces with the focused attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what he is watching. I had seen that look before, on my father when he was reading a grain in a piece of wood, on the older carpenters who knew their trade. It was an honest look. You cannot manufacture it. Either you are paying attention or you are performing attention, and this man was paying it. He turned and caught me looking. He did not pretend he had not noticed. He said, "You follow draft horses?" And I said, "No, but I follow people who do." He laughed, surprised out of himself, a real laugh. We talked at that fence rail for 2 hours. He drove me home at 11 o'clock in a truck with a cracked dashboard and an AM radio that pulled in exactly one station. We talked the whole way. At 23 years old, I had never had the experience of someone listening to me, as though what I was saying was worth the full weight of their attention. He was 31. He had just come back from a year in Indiana learning a different system of crop rotation, and was arguing with his father about whether it applied to Knox County soil. He had strong opinions about drainage tile and a quiet, steady way of holding them. I was married to him 3 years later and I never regretted a day of it, which is not the same as saying every day was easy, but it means what it means. Daniel was Edmund Whitfield's second son. Edmund ran 340 acres of Knox County farmland with the kind of authority that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. When Daniel brought me home that first spring, Edmund met me at the back door with a cup of coffee already poured and said, "Daniel speaks well of you." That means something because he doesn't speak easily. Then he shook my hand the way a man shakes the hand of someone he has already decided to respect. I was from that moment his, not in any possessive way, in the way of a person who has decided you are worth being loyal to and who does not revisit that decision. Raymond's welcome was a different thing entirely. Raymond Whitfield was 6 years older than Daniel, and had grown up understanding that everything of weight in this family would move through him. He ran the farm operations. He made the decisions about planting schedules and equipment purchases, and the management of the land. He occupied the largest portion of every conversation and had been doing so for so long that the family had reshaped itself around his presence the way a field reshapes itself around a tree. His wife Claudette was a woman who had understood from their earliest years together that her position required her to maintain this arrangement, and she maintained it with an efficiency that would have impressed you in another context. Claudette did not say anything overtly cruel to me in those early years. This is important because the cruelty, when it came, was the kind that leaves no visible marks and is therefore difficult to address directly. It was a raised eyebrow at the moment I offered an opinion at the dinner table. It was the way she would ask Daniel a question about plans he and I had already discussed together, as though I were not present to confirm them myself. It was the way she referred to me in the first years, as Daniel's girl in a tone that placed me permanently in a temporary category, like a hat left on a hook that might or might not still be there when you came back. Small things, all of them. The kind that sound like nothing when you try to repeat them. The kind that accumulate over years into a weight you carry without being able to name. The first Thanksgiving I spent at the Whitfield table, I had put 3 days of work into the meal because I wanted to do something right by this family I was entering. I made the turkey and the stuffing and a green bean dish from my mother's recipe, and an apple tart from scratch with apples from the farm's own trees, the Jonathans that grew along the south fence and that Edmund said had been on that land since his grandmother's time. Claudette arrived the afternoon of the holiday with a store-bought pecan pie from the bakery in town. She set it on the counter beside my tart and said, "Oh, how nice you baked," in the tone a person uses when they are observing something charming and not particularly relevant. The family ate everything. No one commented on the tart specifically. Edmund, at the end of the meal, looked across the table at me and said, "You used the right apples." That was his way of saying what he wanted to say, and I knew it, and it was enough for a long time. Edmund had that quality in him, the ability to make a small thing carry a large meaning. He had developed it, I think, in the years after his wife Margaret died of a stroke when Daniel was 16. He raised Daniel's remaining adolescence largely on his own, with Raymond by then already a man running his own portion of the farm. Edmund had come through that loss and emerged with a very clear sense of what was worth saying and what was not, and the things he said tended to mean considerably more than their surface. He paid attention to me in a way that the rest of the family did not. I noticed it early, and I was careful not to rely on it too heavily because attention from the people who are supposed to give it to you and attention from the one person in a room who has decided you are worth it are different things, and you can become dangerously dependent on the latter if you are not careful. He remembered what I told him. Not generally, specifically. I mentioned once, in passing, that my father had built his own workbench from white oak because he believed a carpenter's bench should be heavier than anything you put on it. 2 years later Edmund asked me, out of nowhere, whether my father had ever had trouble with the leg joints in white oak. He had been thinking about it apparently for 2 years. This was the way his mind worked. Daniel and I did not have children. This is a thing I say plainly now because I spent too many years finding ways to say it around. The farm needed children to feel like a farm, and we did not provide them, and there were years when the absence was a daily presence. We made our peace with it at different rates and in different ways. Daniel found his in the neighbor children who came around, in Gerald's kids when they visited, in the particular affection that a childless man can develop for the children of a community if he lets himself. I found mine more slowly and more incompletely and am still finding it, if I am honest. What we had was each other and the farm and Edmund. For the first 20 years of our marriage, the farm was a good life. Not an easy one but a good one. I learned the land the way you learn anything you love, through long, slow noticing. The way certain fields held water after rain and how this predicted the yield. The smell of the soil in April before planting. The way the light changed over the east acreage in the hour before sunset in late September, when the corn was still standing and the light came through at an angle and the whole field went gold. I had not grown up on a farm and had no right to love it the way I came to, and I loved it anyway. Raymond and Claudette never quite accepted that. I remained, in their accounting, a woman from Coshocton who had married into something she was lucky to have, and who should conduct herself accordingly. I was expected to help and I helped. I was not expected to have opinions about the help, and when I had them I learned to offer them carefully, through Daniel indirectly, in ways that could be absorbed without anyone acknowledging where they came from. This wore on me over time. Not dramatically. The way weather wears on a wood surface. Slowly, without any single moment you could point to as the damage. After Daniel died, I thought about leaving. He had a heart attack at 66 years old in early November, in the West Field, checking a tile drainage line that had been giving him trouble all fall. He was alone when it happened. He was gone before the ambulance reached him. I was in the kitchen when the call came, peeling apples, the Jonathans again, for a pie I was making for no particular reason other than that the apples needed using and it was something to do with my hands. I did not leave because of Edmund. Edmund was 83 years old when Daniel died. He had the physical confidence of a man who has done heavy work all his life, and the slower movements of a man whose body has begun to keep its own schedule. He needed help in ways he would not ask for directly and that I could provide without making him name them. We did not discuss whether I would stay. I stayed. This is how decisions happen between people who understand each other. Not through conversation but through action, the action being its own statement. Raymond and Claudette expected me to leave. I understood this from the way Claudette mentioned, twice in the year after Daniel's death, that there were very nice senior communities opening in Gambier, very active, very well regarded. She said it the way you mention something to a person you are hoping will take the hint, which is gently with concern performed around the edges. I stayed. The last 4 years of Edmund's life I was his primary caretaker. Not by formal arrangement, by necessity. Raymond and Claudette were a half-mile down the road in the house they had built in 1989, and managed their household with their own rhythm. Gerald was in Columbus with his accounting practice and his life there. There was no one else who would be there on a Tuesday morning to drive Edmund to the specialist in Columbus or who would know, without being told, that he was having a bad pain day from the way he held his shoulders when he came to the kitchen. I managed 12 medications on a schedule I kept in a spiral notebook on the counter. I learned his dietary restrictions so well that I could assess any recipe at a glance and know what needed changing and what was off the table entirely. I drove him to appointments in Columbus and Gambier and one specialist in Cleveland and sat in the waiting rooms for as long as it took and brought the questions we had prepared together on an index card and made sure they were asked and the answers written down. I read to him in the evenings. He preferred history. Knox County Histories and Ohio River Histories and a book about the early gristmills of the Ohio River watershed that he returned to regularly and handled with the particular care of something you are not yet done with. I came to know the contents of that book almost as well as he did because I read sections of it aloud to him on more than one occasion, and because he would sometimes stop me and say, "Read that part again," and I would, and then he would look out the window for a while in a way that meant he was thinking about something he was not yet going to say. Claudette came on Sundays. She brought a casserole pan. She sat with Edmund for an hour, told him about the farm and the grandchildren and Raymond's plans. Then she left. She never asked about the medications or the schedule. She spoke to me exactly as she always had, which is to say she spoke at the situation without acknowledging the person in it. Edmund noticed. He never said anything directly. But on an evening in the 3rd year of his decline, when Claudette had come and gone and the house was quiet, he sat in his chair with his coffee and looked at me for a long time and said, "You know what patience costs, Nora. I hope you know that I know that too." I told him it was fine. He said, "I didn't ask if it was fine." I put down the dish I was drying and looked at him. "No," I said. "You didn't." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window the November fields were dark and bare. He said, "There are things in that mill I want you to have." "Not yet. When the time comes you'll know. The key is in the study, top shelf of the left cabinet behind the ledger books. Your name is on it." I asked him what he meant by the mill. He said, "When the time comes." And he picked up his coffee and looked back at the window. That was 14 months before he died. I found the key the afternoon of his death, after the funeral home had come and the forms had been signed and Raymond had walked through the house with the efficient pace of a man taking inventory. Small brass key worn smooth with handling, a strip of masking tape on the bow. On the tape in Edmund's handwriting, Nora. I put it in my coat pocket and said nothing about it to anyone. The will reading was 3 weeks after the funeral. Halford Briggs was the attorney. He was in his 60s, precise, with the practiced neutrality of a man who has read a great many wills and understood long ago that his job is to read them accurately, not to have opinions about them. The conference room on the second floor of his building on Court Street had mahogany furniture and a window looking out over the Mount Vernon rooftops in the gray March light. I arrived first and sat at the near end of the table. Raymond and Claudette arrived together and took the far end. Gerald and Patrice sat beside them. The four of them had the easy arrangement of people who already know the outcome and have come only to receive it. Halford Briggs read the will with measured care. Raymond received the farmhouse and 300 acres of tillable land and the farm equipment. The equipment alone was worth $240,000. The land in Knox County at current prices was worth considerably more than that. Gerald received Edmund's savings accounts and investment portfolio, $182,000. There were bequests to the grandchildren, a gift to the church Edmund had attended for 50 years, a small sum to a neighbor who had helped with the harvest for 3 decades. Then Halford Briggs reached the final bequest. To my daughter-in-law, Nora Louise Whitfield, I leave the 12-acre mill parcel known as the Whitfield Mill tract, including the mill structure, the Heron Creek easement, and all rights, interests, and encumbrances attached thereto, recorded at the Knox County Recorder's Office under instrument number 2006-0847. The room was quiet for exactly the amount of time it takes a person to process something and decide what to do with the processing. Then Raymond laughed. It was a clean, contained laugh, the kind that has been waiting and knows exactly where it is going. He looked at Claudette, who made the pressed lip expression. Then he looked at me across the length of the mahogany table. "Well, Nora." He said it with the satisfaction of a man delivering a long-anticipated verdict. "Enjoy your swamp." Gerald said nothing. Patrice studied her hands. Halford Briggs continued with the remaining formalities in the unchanged tone of a professional who has heard every register of human smallness and does not react to any of them. I looked at the window, at the rooftops of Mount Vernon in the March light. I thought about what Edmund had said 14 months ago. "When the time comes, you'll know." I signed what needed to be signed. I shook Halford Briggs's hand and thanked him. I walked down the stairs and out onto Court Street and sat in my car with my coat across my lap and the key in my pocket and the sound of Raymond's laugh still in the room I had just left. The Whitfield Mill had not operated since 1964. Edmund's grandfather Clarence had built it in 1887 on Heron Creek, 2 stories of timber frame construction set on a sandstone foundation, designed to mill grain for the farms of the county. It had run for 77 years until a spring flood shifted the creek channel and left the mill sitting in a margin of water that never fully receded. Edmund's father had tried to manage the flooding for a decade and eventually conceded. By the time Edmund was running the farm, the mill was a closed chapter, the kind of thing you point out to a visitor as a piece of history and then move past. I had been to the mill perhaps a dozen times in 38 years of marriage. It sat at the southeast corner of the Whitfield property, reached by a 2-rut track off the county road, screened from the farm buildings by a run of scrub woods. The standing water made access difficult most of the year. The structure had been on the county's condemned property list since the late 1980s. The county tax records valued the 12-acre parcel at $11,000, which Raymond had been fond of citing when the subject came up. Everyone agreed it was worthless. If you're still with me, please take a second and hit that like button right now. It means everything, and what Edmund left in that mill is going to change every single thing. Subscribe if you haven't already because you are going to want to see this through. I drove to the mill that Thursday evening. It was nearly 5 o'clock when I turned off the county road onto the track. The light was going gray-gold at the edges, the way March light goes in Ohio when the sun gets low and the clouds come in from the west. The track had 2 ruts in the grass and scrub growth pressing in on both sides. and my car came through it slowly and emerged into a small clearing I had not visited in at least 10 years. The mill was standing. I had expected, in some shapeless way, to find more ruin than I found. I had expected collapse. What stood before me instead was a structure that had absorbed 60 years of weather and flooding and abandonment and was still vertical, still closed, still present in the way of things that were built when people built things to last. The timber frame was intact along every visible line. The stone foundation, Ohio sandstone laid by Clarence Whitfield in 1887, had settled in places but had not failed. The south wall showed the high water line from decades of seasonal flooding, a horizontal stripe of discoloration and moss running about 4 feet from the ground. Above that line the boards were weathered gray but the wood was sound. Heron Creek ran 30 feet east of the building, moving along the channel it had shifted to in 1964, carrying the snowmelt runoff from the fields upstream. Between the creek and the mill sat a low margin of soft ground and sedge grass and standing water, deeper now in March than it would be in summer, a pale sheet of water reflecting the gray sky. The ground immediately around the mill's south entrance was mud. Not soft mud, the kind that takes your foot. I sat in my car with the key in my hand. On the masking tape in his handwriting, Nora. I had no boots. I had my good shoes from the Will reading and a coat that was not waterproof. I sat for a long time looking at the mill through the windshield, making the reasonable calculation. Then I got out of the car. The ground took my left foot up to the ankle on the second step. I lost the shoe briefly and had to reach into the cold mud to retrieve it, and the sock was immediately soaking and the cold was immediate and the mud smelled like creek bottom and old iron. I moved more carefully after that, testing before stepping, tracking along the edge of the soft zone where the scrub grass provided at least the pretense of solid ground. The door was old barnwood hung on iron strap hinges, rusted the color of dried blood. The lock was a padlock through a hasp, and the padlock was newer than everything around it, oiled not corroded. Edmund had changed this lock at some point, not long ago. The brass key went in smoothly on the first try and the padlock opened without resistance. Inside, the mill smelled of water and old wood and the mineral cold of stone that has been wet for 60 years. The light entering through gaps in the siding and through 2 small windows set high on the east wall gave just enough visibility to see the main floor in the dimness. The millstone still in its frame, a great gray disc 6 feet across, tilted slightly and silent. The wooden gear works and drive shaft at various stages of survival, some warped and split, some intact with a soundness that surprised me. The meal chest against the east wall, its wood gray but whole. The main floor was elevated on the stone foundation, sitting perhaps 3 feet above the surrounding ground. This elevation had been the difference, in wet seasons, between a ruined floor and a merely damp one. The boards underfoot were gray and soft in places. I tested each step before I put my weight on it, moving the way Edmund had moved in his last years. Carefully, with respect for what might not hold. There was a ladder against the north wall. It was aluminum, newer than anything in the building, leaning against the wall at a deliberate angle. Not stored. Positioned. It reached up to a hatch in the ceiling, a square opening 6 feet by 6 standing open. The upper story of the mill was dry. Edmund had told me this once in passing, that the upper story stayed dry because it was above the weather line and because he had repaired the roof 3 times in the last 20 years. At the time I had not asked why he cared about the roof on a building no one used. I climbed the ladder. The upper room was not large. A plain square space with a low ceiling and exposed rafters and 2 windows, one facing north and one facing east. The March light came through both of them in pale rectangles. The room was clean in a way that spoke of recent tending. The floor was free of debris. The dust that should have been everywhere was not. Along the north wall sat a workbench. On the workbench was a shop lamp and an orange extension cord that ran down through a small hole in the floor. I traced it, through the hole across the main floor below, through a gap in the south wall, to a small generator mounted on a wooden platform outside the building, secured with a chain and padlock. Edmund had wired electricity to this room. He had installed a generator and a lamp and had kept the fuel can beside the generator full enough to work by. A stool stood in front of the workbench. It was a plain shop stool, the kind sold at hardware stores, with a round seat and adjustable height. The kind of stool you put in a workspace where you intend to spend time. On the workbench beside the lamp sat a metal document box. olive green, the size of a large briefcase, with a combination lock on the hasp. The kind of box sold for fireproof document storage. Beside it, taped flat to the workbench surface, was a piece of paper. I leaned in to read it. On the paper, in Edmund's handwriting, was a combination. 1887. The year his grandfather built the mill. I sat on the stool. I looked at the box. Outside, the creek moved over its stones in the growing dark, the sound of it reaching through the board siding, steady and low. My feet were soaking inside my ruined shoes. The air in the upper room was cold and smelled of cedar and dry wood, and the faintest trace of the tobacco Edmund had given up 20 years ago, but that had lived in the fibers of the clothes he wore for the rest of his life. I had spent 38 years being careful about what I hoped for. Not because hoping was wrong, but because the specific kind of hope that lives in other people's intentions has a way of arriving differently than you expect, and I had learned this slowly and at some cost. I had hoped, at various points, for acknowledgement I did not receive. For a seat at a table that kept being set without me. I had made my peace with the fact that this was the shape of my life in this family, and I had made it a real peace, not a performance of peace, because I had Daniel and I had Edmund and I had the farm and I had the honest work of it all, and that had been enough. But now Daniel was gone. And Edmund was gone. And Raymond had laughed in that conference room, and Claudette had made the pressed lip expression, and Gerald had looked at the table, and I had walked out of that building with a key in my pocket and the deed to 12 acres of flooded land. And here I was, on a stool in a dry room above a flooded gristmill that a dead man had wired for electricity and cleaned and equipped with a combination lock set to the year his grandfather built it. I turned the lock to 1887. It opened clean. Inside the box was a manila envelope with my name on it in Edmund's careful, slower late years print. Under the envelope sat a thick accordion folder held with a rubber band. Under the folder was a smaller envelope with a return address printed in the upper left corner. Vance & Associates, Attorney at Law, Columbus, Ohio. I took the manila envelope. I turned it over. On the back, in the handwriting that had grown slower in his last years but had never lost its character, Edmund had written one line. You were the right one for this family, Nora. Even when we weren't the right family for you. I sat with that for a long time. The March dark was coming in through the east window. The creek below had gone invisible in the dimness and was now only sound, steady and unhurried, as though it had no opinion about time and no need for light to continue. My coat was not warm enough for sitting still. My feet had gone past cold into a simple numbness that I was not yet concerned about. I thought about that night in the kitchen 14 months ago, when Edmund had looked out at the dark fields and said, when the time comes. I thought about the way he had handled the book about Ohio gristmills, the specific care of it, the returning to certain pages. I thought about the way he had looked at me across dinner tables for 38 years when the rest of them were looking through me. The kind of look that says, I see you. Clearly. You are not what they think. I thought about Raymond's laugh. And I opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, written in that careful late years hand. The hand that compensated for the tremor by slowing down rather than giving in to it. The first page began the way Edmund began everything that mattered to him. Without ceremony and without waste. Nora, if you are reading this, you found the mill and you found the key and you came anyway, wet shoes and all. That is the most Nora thing I can imagine, and I am glad of it. I need to tell you what you are standing on. I read that line twice. Then I set the letter down on the workbench and pressed my hands flat against the surface and breathed the cold cedar air of the upper room of the Whitfield Mill and understood, in the way you understand things that have been building for a long time and have finally arrived, that Edmund Whitfield had not left me a swamp. He had left me something he had been building for 40 years. And on that Thursday evening, with the March dark coming down outside and the creek running steady below, I was about to find out exactly what it was. I want to tell you something about the way Edmund Whitfield wrote a letter. He was not a man who used 10 words when 3 would do. He had spent 60 years making decisions on a working farm, where clarity was not a courtesy but a requirement, and that habit had shaped the way he communicated about everything. He did not preamble. He did not soften what needed to be said. He said the thing and then he said the next thing, and when he was done he stopped. His letters to Daniel over the years had been the same way. Brief, direct, warm in the way a good tool is warm, useful in your hand. The letter he left me in that metal box on the workbench of the Whitfield Mill's upper room was 4 pages long. For Edmund, 4 pages was a monument. I sat on that stool in the cold upper room with the March dark coming through the windows, and I read every word of it twice. My wet shoes had gone from cold to numb. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now let's get back to the story. The shop lamp cast a clean circle of light on the workbench and the pages in my hands. Outside, the creek moved. I read. If you are coming back to this story, welcome. If you are new here, subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. What Edmund put in that letter is what this whole story turns on, and we are just getting to it. The letter began the way I told you, without ceremony. Nora, if you are reading this, you found the mill and you found the key and you came anyway, wet shoes and all. That is the most Nora thing I can imagine, and I am glad of it. I need to tell you what you are standing on. He had written the date at the top of the first page, 11 months before he died. He had been well enough then to drive himself, and he had driven to this mill on a Tuesday morning in April and climbed the ladder and sat at this workbench and written this by hand. I know this because he told me so in the second paragraph, and because the handwriting on the first page was steadier than on the pages that followed, the steadiness of a man who had not yet reached the worst of the tremor. He told me about the water rights first because he said he wanted to give me the most important thing immediately before anything else, in case I had to stop reading for any reason and come back. The Whitfield Mill had been built on Heron Creek in 1887 by his grandfather Clarence Whitfield. When Clarence built the mill, he registered a water right with the county, the right to divert a specified volume of Heron Creek for the operation of the millworks. This registration predated the Ohio Water Rights Act of 1917. It predated the state's entire modern framework for water allocation. It was what water law calls a prior appropriation right, the oldest class of water right in the state system, the kind that does not expire, does not lapse, and cannot be superseded by later claims. The 12-acre mill parcel, which I now owned, held that water right. The 300 acres Raymond had just inherited, the tillable fields, the corn and soybean operation, the farm Edmund had built his life on, those acres drew their irrigation water from Heron Creek. They had drawn it from Heron Creek for 30 years, since Raymond had installed the irrigation system in the early 1990s. Edmund had allowed this informally, as a father allows a son the use of a thing without paperwork, without a formal conveyance, because Edmund was still alive and the mill parcel was still his and the arrangement was between family. Now Edmund was gone. The water right belonged to the mill parcel. The mill parcel belonged to me. Without a formal easement from me, Raymond's irrigation system had no legal basis to draw from Heron Creek. He could apply for a new water right under the modern framework, but new appropriations in Knox County were subject to review, to environmental assessment, to a waiting period that ran anywhere from 8 months to 3 years depending on the current allocation status of the watershed. And planting season in Knox County began in late April. 6 weeks away. I sat with that paragraph for a long time. Edmund had written in the margin beside it, in letters slightly larger than the rest. I am not asking you to be cruel. I am asking you to be clear. Those are different things. He went on. He told me about the Conservancy. 18 months before his death, Edmund had been contacted by a representative of the Heron Creek Watershed Conservancy, a regional land trust operating under a federal conservation program. The Conservancy was working to restore the natural hydrology of Heron Creek, which had been degraded by agricultural runoff, straightening, and tile drainage over the course of the 20th century. The creek restoration project required the acquisition of senior water rights on the upper watershed to establish minimum flow standards. The Whitfield Mill water right was the oldest and most significant right on that stretch of the creek. The Conservancy had offered to purchase the right outright, or to accept it as a conservation easement with a corresponding payment. After 18 months of back and forth with Edmund, the offer had reached a number: $620,000. Edmund had not sold. He had told the Conservancy representative, a woman named Joan Holler, that he could not finalize any agreement until after his estate was settled and that the person they needed to speak with was his daughter-in-law, Nora Whitfield, who would be in contact when she was ready. He had given Joan Holler my name. He had told her to wait. He had been holding that number for 18 months, keeping it quiet, keeping it out of any conversation Raymond might have been part of, keeping it here in this room in this box waiting for me. $620,000. I set the letter down and looked at the lamp on the workbench. The light was steady and yellow and warm. Outside, the creek ran over its stones in the dark. I am not a woman who is accustomed to numbers like that. I grew up pricing lumber. I married a farmer. I have managed a household budget carefully for 38 years and understood, with the accuracy my parents gave me, exactly what things cost and what they did not cost. $620,000 was not a number that had ever appeared in any calculation I had made about my own life. Edmund had known this. He had written in the third page of the letter, "I know this is more than you expected. I know you will want to sit with it, which is the right instinct. Don't let anyone rush you. You have time. The Conservancy will wait because they have been waiting and because what they need is yours and there is no substitute for it." Then he wrote, "The accordion folder has everything: the Conservancy correspondence, the water right documentation, the deed recording, and the historical survey report from the State Preservation Office. Read it in that order. Then call Patricia Vance. Her number is on the envelope in the box. She has been waiting for your call for 14 months. She knows who you are." He had arranged an attorney. He had briefed her. He had given her my name and told her I would call. I thought about the morning in the kitchen 14 months ago. I thought about the way he had said "when the time comes," and then picked up his coffee and gone back to his chair. I thought about all the evenings I had read to him from the Ohio Gristmill history, about the particular attention he gave to certain passages, about the way he handled that book. He had been building this quietly for years. The ladder in the mill, the new padlock, the generator and the lamp, the workbench and the stool. He had been coming out here when he could still drive himself, before the decline made that impossible, and he had been arranging things. On the last page of the letter, after all the practical instructions, after the attorney and the Conservancy and the accordion folder, Edmund had written one more thing. He wrote, "I have watched you in this family for 38 years. I have watched you give without being asked, stay without being asked to stay, work without expecting to be acknowledged. I have watched my son Raymond take the shape of his own certainty, and I have let that happen because I am his father and because some things a man does not know how to correct in his children. I am sorry for that. It has cost you more than it should have, and I knew it was costing you, and I am sorry I did not do more about it while I was alive to do it. I am doing what I can now. You are not an afterthought, Nora. You were never an afterthought. The mill parcel is the best piece of land in this whole estate, and I have known it for 20 years, and I kept that knowledge here because the people in this family who would have used that knowledge if they had it are not the people I wanted to have it. You are. Take care of what I built. Not the buildings. The plan. The plan will hold if you let it. Trust Patricia Vance. Trust Joan Holler at the Conservancy. Trust your own judgment, which has always been better than you have been given reason to believe. The family will come to you when they understand what you have. Let them come. You do not owe anyone a quick answer. I loved your husband. I love you. That is the whole of it." Edmund, I folded the letter and held it with both hands in my lap, and sat in the upper room of the Whitfield Mill for a long time. The creek ran. The lamp was steady. My feet were numb and my coat was not warm enough, and I was 67 years old and alone in a flooded gristmill in the March dark. And I had just read the most important 4 pages I had ever held in my life. I did not cry right away. I have learned, over the years, that the largest things do not always arrive with tears immediately. Sometimes they arrive with a stillness first, a kind of interior quiet that happens before the feeling moves. I sat in that stillness and I let it be what it was. Then I opened the accordion folder. Edmund had organized it with the care of a man who respected order. Each section was labeled in his handwriting on a tab cut from cardstock. Water rights documentation. Conservancy correspondence. Historical survey. Attorney. I read each section in the order he had specified. The water right documentation was a certified copy of the original 1887 registration, filed with Knox County when Clarence Whitfield built the mill. 3 pages of handwritten legal language, the ink brown with age, recorded and certified by the county recorder in a block stamp at the bottom of the last page. Attached to it was a more recent document, a title search Edmund had commissioned 2 years before his death, confirming that the water right remained attached to the mill parcel and had never been transferred, sold, or otherwise conveyed. It was exactly what Edmund had described. Prior to 1917. Unencumbered. Valid. Attached to the title search was a separate 1-page memorandum from Patricia Vance's firm, dated 14 months ago. It read, in part, "The water right described in the 1887 registration instrument is legally valid, fully transferable as appurtenant to the mill parcel, and represents a senior appropriation with priority over all subsequent rights on the Heron Creek watershed. In our professional assessment, this right is the most significant single asset in the Whitfield estate." I read that sentence 3 times. The most significant single asset in the Whitfield estate. Not the farmhouse. Not the 300 acres. Not the equipment or the savings. The flooded mill and the water right it carried. The Conservancy correspondence was a thick stack of letters between Joan Haller and Edmund, going back 22 months. The early letters were exploratory, Joan Haller explaining the Conservancy's restoration goals, and the role the Whitfield water right would play in establishing minimum flows on Heron Creek. Edmund's replies, when I could see them in the copies he had kept, were brief and measured. He asked precise questions. He waited for precise answers. He did not commit. The final letter in the stack was from Joan Haller, dated 8 months before Edmund died. It confirmed the Conservancy's final offer. $620,000 for a permanent conservation easement, transferring the water right to the Conservancy in perpetuity. Joan Haller noted that the offer reflected the water right's value to the restoration project, and would remain open until December of the following year. She wrote at the end, "We understand Mr. Whitfield is not in a position to move forward at this time, and that the right person to make this decision will be his daughter-in-law, Nora Whitfield. We will wait. Please tell her we look forward to hearing from her when she is ready. Tell her we look forward to hearing from her." Edmund had told them my name. He had told them to wait for me. I sat with that for a while. Then I opened the historical survey section. The Ohio Historic Preservation Office had conducted a field survey of the Whitfield Mill 14 months before Edmund's death, at Edmund's request. The surveyor was a woman named Dr. Inez Farrow, and her report ran to 12 pages with photographs. The conclusion was on the first page before the detailed findings. The Whitfield Mill is one of 14 surviving pre-1890 gristmill structures in Ohio with intact millstone and drive machinery. It is, in this surveyor's professional opinion, one of the most significant examples of 19th-century vernacular mill architecture in the state, and is eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Eligible for the National Register. The report went on. A National Register listing would make the mill eligible for a state historic preservation grant of up to $75,000 for stabilization and restoration work. It would qualify for a 20% federal historic tax credit on any qualified rehabilitation expenditure. It would establish the property's historic significance in a way that could support heritage tourism development or educational programming. Edmund had commissioned this survey quietly, at his own expense, and had kept the results in this box in this room and had told no one. I looked at the photographs in the survey report. Dr. Farrow had photographed the millstone and the gearworks and the foundation in the upper room I was sitting in, the room Edmund had cleaned and equipped. She had photographed the workbench. In one photograph, Edmund himself appeared at the edge of the frame, standing near the north wall with his hands at his sides, looking at the millstone. He was wearing his brown canvas work coat and his old hat. He looked smaller than I remembered him being, the way people look smaller in photographs than they do in life, but his posture was straight and his face, in the partial profile the camera had caught, held the expression I knew well. The expression of a man paying full attention to something he found worth the effort. I set the survey report down. I had been in this room for over an hour. The cold had moved past my feet and into my legs. The lamp was still steady. I needed to get back to my car and drive to the farmhouse, and I needed to decide what to do next, and I needed to do it carefully and in the right order. Edmund had said, "Trust your own judgment." My judgment at that moment was clear. I pulled out the small envelope with the Columbus return address and opened it. Inside was Patricia Vance's card and a handwritten note from Edmund, 3 lines. "Patricia is expecting your call. She has the file. Tell her you read the letter." I put everything back in the metal box in the order it had been. I closed the lid. I set the combination lock. I climbed back down the ladder, moving carefully, one rung at a time, the way you descend in the dark when you cannot afford to fall. I crossed the main floor, testing each board. I pulled the door shut behind me and locked the padlock and heard the click of it settle. I walked back through the mud to my car, lost the shoe again at exactly the same spot, retrieved it with the same cold mud on my hand. I sat in the driver's seat. I looked at the mill and the headlights for a long time. The sandstone foundation, the weathered siding above the high water line, the sound timber frame of a thing built in 1887 by a man named Clarence Whitfield, who understood that if you built something right it would outlast the reasons you had for building it. I drove back to the farmhouse. In the kitchen, I stood at the counter and looked at the room where I had cooked 38 years of meals and managed 12 medications and read history aloud and kept the calendar of a family that had spent most of that time not quite seeing me. The room looked the same. The cook stove and the cabinets and the window above the sink that looked out on the east field. Edmund's coffee cup was still in the cabinet. I had not moved it. Claudette had called while I was at the mill. The voicemail was brief. "Raymond and I would like to discuss the estate settlement timeline when you have a moment. No particular urgency, but there are some practical matters. Thank you, Nora. No particular urgency." I set the phone on the counter and made tea and sat at the table and looked at the east field in the darkness outside the window and thought about what Edmund had said. Let them come. You do not owe anyone a quick answer. I did not call Claudette back that night. In the morning of Friday I called Patricia Vance. She answered on the second ring in the direct, unhurried manner of a woman who has been expecting a call and is prepared for it. She said, "Nora Whitfield." Not a question. A confirmation. "I read the letter," I said. "Good," she said. "Then you know what you have. Are you somewhere you can talk for a while?" I told her I was. We talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Patricia Vance was a property and water rights attorney who had been practicing in Columbus for 27 years. Edmund had found her through the conservancy process, 2 years before his death, when he began to understand that what he was building needed someone who knew the specific shape of it. She had met with him 4 times. She had the entire file. The water right documents, the conservancy correspondence, the title search, Dr. Farrow's historical survey, and a legal memorandum she had prepared on the relevant Ohio statutes. She walked me through every piece of it in a deliberate sequence, not rushing, pausing when she wanted me to absorb something before moving on. She confirmed the water rights validity in language clearer than anything I could have managed myself. She confirmed the conservancy offer and told me it was, in her professional assessment, a fair number for what the right was worth to that specific buyer, and that another buyer in a different context might offer more or less, but that the conservancy offer was solid and well documented and unlikely to decrease. She told me about Raymond's irrigation. She said this carefully because she is a careful person, but she said it clearly. Raymond's irrigation system drew from Heron Creek under an informal arrangement that had existed only because Edmund permitted it. Edmund had never conveyed a formal water easement to the farm. He had intended the arrangement to remain informal during his lifetime because he did not want conflict with his son. Now that the mill parcel had passed to me, Raymond's continued irrigation use of Heron Creek required, at minimum, a written easement agreement from me as the holder of the senior water right. Without such an agreement, his use was legally problematic. How problematic? I said. She was quiet for a moment. The Conservancy has been in contact with the State Water Authority regarding the restoration project. When the easement transfer moves forward, if it moves forward, the state will review all downstream uses on that stretch of the creek. Any use without proper authorization would be flagged. Does Raymond know about the water right? Edmund was very careful, Patricia said. He never discussed the mill parcel's legal status with Raymond. The county tax records show the parcel's assessed value at $11,000, which is the land value only, no attached rights. Raymond would have seen that number and drawn the obvious conclusion. I thought about Raymond in the conference room, the ease of the laugh, the certainty in the conclusion he had drawn the moment Halford Briggs read my portion of the will. Enjoy your swamp. He doesn't know, I said. No, Patricia said. He doesn't know. She told me what my options were. I could sell the water right to the Conservancy for the offered sum and be done with it. Clean. Final. $620,000. I could negotiate an easement with Raymond, allowing his continued irrigation use in exchange for compensation, and separately proceed with the Conservancy. The two were not mutually exclusive. I could hold the water right and do nothing immediately, taking time to consider. I could pursue the historical designation through Dr. Farrow's survey, apply for the preservation grant, and begin the process of stabilizing and eventually restoring the mill itself. All of these were open to me. All of them were mine to choose. What would you advise? I said. I'd advise you not to be rushed, she said. Planting season is 6 weeks away. That is meaningful timing for Raymond. It is not meaningful timing for the Conservancy, who have been patient for a year and a half and will continue to be patient. Edmund understood this. He timed the will to give you the maximum possible position. I held the phone and looked out the kitchen window at the east field. The field Raymond had irrigated every spring for 30 years from water that had, all along, belonged to the mill. I'd like to meet in person, I said, before I do anything else. Patricia said she could come to Knox County the following Thursday. I thanked her and ended the call. I sat at the table for a while with my tea gone cold in front of me and the kitchen around me, and the sense, growing by the hour, that the ground under my feet was different from what it had been 2 days ago. Not because anything physical had changed, but because I now understood what the ground actually was. Raymond called at 11:15. I looked at his name on the screen. I let it ring. He left no message. Claudette called at 11:40. I let that ring too. At 12:30, a knock at the back door. I want to tell you something about Raymond Whitfield's face. It is a farmer's face, weathered and angular, with the set jaw and the squint lines of a man who has spent 60+ years looking at weather and deciding what to do about it. For most of my adult life, when I have been in this man's presence, that face has carried a particular expression toward me. The expression of a man tolerating a presence he did not choose and does not find relevant. Not hostile. Simply indifferent, in the specific way that powerful people are indifferent to those they have decided are beneath the threshold of their attention. He did not have that expression when I opened the back door. He had a different one. Something careful. Something that was trying to be composed and was not entirely succeeding. Nora, he said. We need to talk. If you have been with me this far, please take a moment right now and hit that like button. Takes 2 seconds and it means everything. Subscribe if you haven't already, because Raymond is standing at the door and what happens in this conversation is the whole turning point of this story. I opened the door wider and stepped back. He came into the kitchen. He had taken his boots off at the mat, which he did not always do, and this small thing told me something about the conversation he had prepared himself for. He stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked around it in the way a person looks at a space that is both familiar and, in this particular moment, strange. He had grown up in this kitchen. His mother had cooked at that stove. For 40-odd years it had been, in his accounting, his kitchen, managed by whoever was managing it at the time. First his mother, then Nora, a succession of useful presences. He stood in the middle of it now like a man who was recalculating something. I got a letter, he said. I waited. He took an envelope from his jacket pocket. It was not sealed. He had already opened it and read it and carried it here. The return address on the envelope, even from across the kitchen I could read. Vance and Associates, Attorney at Law, Columbus, Ohio. Patricia Vance had sent Raymond a letter. I had not known she was going to do this, but when I thought about it for approximately 3 seconds I understood why Edmund had chosen her. She had not waited for me to ask. She had moved in the right order. Edmund had said trust Patricia Vance, and I understood now what he had meant. Not trust her to wait for your instructions, but trust her to understand the shape of the thing and move accordingly. It says, Raymond began and then stopped, which was unlike him. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at me. It says that the mill parcel includes a pre-1917 water appropriation right on Heron Creek. It says this right is senior to all subsequent claims. It says that my irrigation system has been drawing from Heron Creek under an informal arrangement that is no longer operative now that the mill parcel has changed hands. He held the letter up slightly, not quite offering it, not quite keeping it. It says I need a formal easement from the mill parcel owner to continue irrigating, and that the mill parcel owner is you. I held his eyes. I did not say anything. He set the letter on the kitchen table. He put both hands on the back of a chair, not sitting, just holding. He was 69 years old and had been running this farm for 30 years and had never, in all of that time, had to ask me for anything. He did not know how to do it, and he knew he had to do it, and those two things were at war in his face. Planting is 6 weeks out, he said. I know when planting is, Raymond. Without water. He stopped. He took a breath. The corn needs water. The beans need water. The whole east block of the acreage runs on the creek irrigation. Without it, I'm either dry farming 300 acres in a year that the forecast says will be below rainfall average, or I'm drilling new wells at a cost and a timeline that... He stopped again. I had never seen Raymond Whitfield not finish a sentence in 38 years of meals at the same table. I need the easement, Nora. He said it flat and clean. No cushion around it. It was, I thought, the most honest thing he had ever said to me, because it was the first thing he had ever genuinely needed from me rather than expected. I looked at him. I thought about what Edmund had written. I am not asking you to be cruel. I am asking you to be clear. Those are different things. I thought about Patricia Vance telling me not to be rushed. About Joan Holler and the Conservancy. About $620,000 sitting in a folder in a metal box in a flooded mill. About 38 years of folded dish towels and good olive oil and dinners cooked for celebrations I was not invited to, and being handed a key with my name on the tape. I was not going to be cruel, but I was going to be clear. I have an attorney meeting scheduled for Thursday, I said. I'll need to understand the full picture before I make any decisions about the water right. Thursday. He repeated the word as though he were measuring it. That's a week away. Yes. Nora. Raymond. My voice did not shake. It had not shaken once since I opened Edmund's letter, and I did not intend for it to start now. You stood in that attorney's office 2 days ago and laughed at what I was left. You called it a swamp. So you will understand if I take the time I need to make considered decisions about what I was actually left before I commit to anything. The kitchen was very quiet. Raymond's hands were still on the back of the chair. He looked at me with an expression I did not recognize on him, and then I did recognize it, and the recognition surprised me. It was the expression of a man who knows he has been wrong about something for a long time and has just been handed the proof. He said after a moment, Dad knew. It was not a question. Yes, I said. How long? 20 years from what I can piece together. He absorbed this. He looked at the window, then at the table, then at his own hands on the chair back. He never said a word to me. No, I said. He didn't. I watched the meaning of that settle into him. Edmund had known for 20 years and had kept it here in this room, and had let Raymond run the farm and make the decisions and occupy the largest space, and had not said a word, because the person Edmund wanted to have this information was not Raymond. It was the woman Raymond had been laughing at for 38 years. The quiet in the kitchen had a different quality now. Not hostile. Something more like the quiet after a door closes and you are standing in the room alone for the first time and everything is rearranging itself. I'll wait for Thursday, Raymond said. He picked up the letter from the table and folded it and put it back in his jacket. He walked to the door. He put his boots on. At the threshold he stopped. He did not turn around. He said to the door frame in a voice I had not heard from him before, something that was not practiced or prepared. She must have known what she was doing. Leaving it to you. He meant Claudette for a moment, and then I understood he meant Edmund. Yes, I said. He knew exactly what he was doing. Raymond nodded once to the door frame and left. I stood in the kitchen and listened to his truck back down the drive and turn onto the county road, and the sound of it diminished toward his farm. Then I sat down at the table and put my face in my hands and let myself shake quietly for about 3 minutes, because that was what my body needed after 2 days of holding still, and I had learned by now to give my body what it needed. Then I got up and made fresh tea and called Bess. Bess Conroy had been my closest friend for 22 years. Since the fall we had both signed up for a Knox County Master Gardener program, and discovered we were the only 2 people in a room of 20 who had actual opinions about drainage. She was 70 years old, retired, a former high school biology teacher, and she had the particular quality of true friends everywhere, which is that she answered her phone regardless of the hour and asked the one right question instead of 4 wrong ones. I told her the main lines of it. The water right, the conservancy, the letter, Raymond at the door. She was quiet through all of it in the way she was quiet when she was paying full attention. When I was done, she said, "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I think so." "Edmund," she said, in the tone of someone who knew him well enough to place this. "Edmund," I agreed. "He was building this for years," she said. It was not a question. She had known Edmund. She had sat at his kitchen table. "Years," I said. "And he never said a word to anyone." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" she said. The one right question. Not what are you going to do, not what does the lawyer say, not what would be smart. What do you want? I looked at the east field through the kitchen window. I thought about the mill, the way it had looked in my headlights the night before, still standing after 60 years of being told it was worthless. The sandstone foundation. The sound timber frame. The millstone in its place on the main floor, patient, not going anywhere. I thought about Edmund's face in Dr. Farrow's photograph, standing near the north wall in his brown canvas coat, looking at the millstone with the expression of a man who finds something worth his attention. I thought about the upper room, the workbench and the stool and the lamp, the box with the combination set to 1887. "I want to restore the mill," I said. And that was the moment I understood what this was. Not the water right, not the conservancy money, not the legal position that had Raymond Whitfield standing in my kitchen with his hands on a chair back trying to find words for something he had never needed to say to me before. Those were pieces of it. Important pieces. But the center of it, the thing Edmund had been building for 20 years in the quiet of this farm while his family arranged itself around him and looked past the mill on the county road and called it nothing, the center of it was this. A man had seen something worth restoring. He had seen it in the building and in the person, and he had spent 20 years building a plan that would give both of them a chance. And now the plan was in my hands. Bess came over the next morning with a pot of soup, and the particular energy she brought to situations that required her to set her opinions aside and simply be present. She did not always manage it because Bess had strong opinions about most things and a biologist's habit of wanting to classify and explain and draw a conclusion. But she was trying, which I could see in the way she set the pot on the stove and filled 2 bowls without commenting on the state of my kitchen, which was not its usual state. I had been making tea and forgetting it and leaving cups on various surfaces for 2 days. She sat across from me at the table with her soup and she said, "Tell me about the mill." Not about Raymond, not about the money, not about what I was going to do. The mill. She had understood from 30 years of knowing me that the physical thing was where I needed to start. I told her. I described it the way you describe a place you have been to only once and already cannot stop thinking about. The sandstone foundation and the high water line and the sound of the creek from inside the upper room. The millstone still in its frame. The ladder Edmund had leaned at that deliberate angle, the angle of placement rather than storage. The combination set to 1887. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when something genuinely interested her. When I was done, she looked at her bowl for a moment and then said, "He went out there by himself. While he could still drive. He climbed that ladder and he cleaned that room and he set it up for you." "Yes. Edmund Whitfield," she said, in the way she sometimes said a person's full name when they had done something she wanted to acknowledge properly. I had not let myself think too directly about that part. The physical labor of it. An old man in declining health driving out to a flooded mill on his own and climbing a ladder and making a workspace. The particular determination it required, and the particular tenderness. I could not think about it directly without the stillness arriving first and then, after the stillness, the thing that came after. Bess, who understood this, did not press. She said instead, in the practical tone that was her other mode of being a friend, "What does the restoration actually involve? In real terms?" This was the right question. This was the question that moved me from the feeling to the work, and the work was where I had always been most able to breathe. I told her what Dr. Farrow's report had said. The timber frame was largely intact. The foundation had settled but was not failing. The millworks on the upper story, the gearing and the drive shaft, needed significant professional assessment before any work could be planned, but some of it was surprisingly intact. The major challenges were the flooding, the roof, which Edmund had repaired but which would need ongoing attention, and the south wall, which had taken the most damage from the seasonal water line. The flooding, Bess said. That's the creek. The creek shifted in 1964. Edmund's father tried to manage it for a decade and couldn't. So you'd need to redirect it. Or manage the flooding differently. Channel it or build up the foundation perimeter or some combination. I had been thinking about this since I read Dr. Farrow's report. Not in a technical way, I had no training in hydrology or mill restoration, but in the way you think about a problem when you keep returning to it involuntarily. Dr. Farrow's report mentions that the Conservancy Restoration Project is partly about restoring the creek's natural hydrology. That work on the upper watershed, if it addresses some of the runoff patterns, might actually help the mill. Bess set down her spoon. She had the expression she got when an idea was forming. It was a particular expression. Slightly unfocused, slightly internal. So the Conservancy restores the creek, she said. And in the process, the flooding situation at the mill might improve. I don't know that for certain. I'm going to ask Joan Holler when I talk to her. And Joan Holler is the Conservancy person. Edmund gave her my name. She's been waiting. Bess looked at me across the table. He thought of everything, she said. Not with amazement or not only. With something more like the recognition you give to an act of care that was so quiet and so sustained that you are still discovering its edges. He thought of everything, I said. We ate our soup. Outside, the March fields were gray and the sky was the same color as the fields, and the line between them, in the distance, was difficult to find. I had eaten at this table through 38 Marches, and this one felt different from all of them in a way I was not yet able to fully articulate. Not better exactly. More load-bearing. Like a table that had been decorative for a long time and had just been asked to hold a real weight and was discovering that it was, in fact, made for this. What about Raymond? Bess said. He's coming Thursday. Patricia is coming Thursday. He's coming to your meeting? No. He said he'd wait until Thursday. I assume he'll contact me again at some point. I told him I'd have a better understanding of the situation after I met with Patricia. Bess was quiet for a moment. And what is your understanding of the situation? I thought about how to say it honestly. My understanding is that Raymond needs something from me that he cannot get anywhere else in the time frame that matters to him. And my understanding is that this does not mean I am required to give it to him on his schedule. Edmund's words. Edmund's words. And Patricia's. And yours. I looked at the east field. Also mine, I said. I'm catching up to them. She nodded, and we did not need to say more about it. Patricia Vance arrived on Thursday at 9:30 in a silver sedan that she parked with a precision that suggested a person accustomed to navigating circumstances where small miscalculations had consequences. She was in her mid-50s, compact, with the organized stillness of a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms where other people were less prepared than they should have been. She carried a leather portfolio and shook my hand firmly and accepted coffee and set the portfolio on the table and opened it in a single efficient motion. She had met Edmund 4 times in the last 2 years of his life. She said this not as a preamble but as a way of establishing what she knew and how she knew it. She wanted me to understand that she was not coming in fresh, she was coming in with context. He was very specific about what he wanted for you, she said. Not just what he wanted you to have, but what he wanted the outcome to look like. He thought about it carefully over a long period. The plan is coherent. I want to make sure you understand all of it before we discuss any individual piece. We spent 2 hours at the kitchen table. Patricia walked me through the legal documents in the accordion folder with the same deliberate sequencing Edmund had prescribed, pausing at each section to make sure I understood not just what a document said but what it meant in practice. She was the kind of attorney who believed her clients should understand the thing they were deciding, not just trust her judgment about it, and this made her very good to sit across from. The water right was the hinge. She confirmed everything Edmund had described: the 1887 registration, the pre-1917 status, the unbroken chain of title to the mill parcel. She explained prior appropriation doctrine in a way that was clear without being condescending, and she confirmed that Raymond's irrigation use was legally unsupported without a formal easement from the mill parcel owner. What are his options if I don't grant the easement in time for planting? I asked. He can apply to the state for an emergency temporary use authorization. It's a real mechanism, but it takes time even in the expedited process, and it requires him to demonstrate that denial of the authorization would cause irreparable harm. He could potentially get it, but it would take several weeks at minimum, and it draws the state water authority's attention to the full situation on that stretch of the creek, which is not a situation he wants the state looking at closely. Why not? Because the restoration project and the conservancy easement would likely follow, and with those in place, the Heron Creek allocation would be formally restructured under the restoration framework. Raymond's irrigation rights going forward would be subject to that framework. The minimum flow standards the conservancy wants to establish would constrain how much water he can draw, particularly in dry years. He'd rather negotiate a private easement with you than have the state determine his water rights under the new framework. I absorbed this. He knows this. He may not know all the details, but he knows enough. He's been farming this land for 30 years and he knows water. She looked at me steadily. Edmund knew he would figure it out fast once he understood what the mill parcel actually held. That's part of why Edmund moved quietly. He needed the will to be read before Raymond had any reason to look at the mill parcel's legal status. The timing of Edmund's death was, of course, the one thing none of them had controlled. But he had controlled everything around it as carefully as he could. What do you recommend? I said. She set down her pen. I recommend you grant Raymond a formal water easement. Not because you're obligated to, but because you are not in the business of destroying his farm, and because a well-structured easement protects you as well as him. It establishes clearly in writing the basis and limits of his use. It gives you a legal instrument rather than a continued informal understanding. On what terms? The easement should acknowledge the senior status of your water right. It should include a compensation element, either a one-time payment or an annual fee, in recognition of the value of what you're granting. And it should include a minimum flow provision consistent with the Conservancy's restoration standards, so that Raymond's use is coordinated with the restoration rather than in tension with it. He won't like that last part. He won't like it. But he needs the easement more than he dislikes the terms, and he knows it. I thought about Raymond at the door, standing in the middle of this kitchen with his hands on the chair back, saying the most honest thing he had ever said to me. What's the right number? I said. For the compensation. Patricia looked at her portfolio. I've drafted some figures for discussion. Given the value of the right and the extent of his irrigation dependency, a one-time payment in the range of $40,000 to $60,000 is defensible. An annual fee in the range of $3,000 to $5,000, running with the land, is the alternative. The one-time payment is cleaner. The annual fee is more accurately reflective of the ongoing value. I thought about that for a moment. About Raymond having to write that check or write those checks year after year. I thought about Edmund. I am not asking you to be cruel. I am asking you to be clear. I'll think about which structure, I said. But the compensation element stays. Of course, Patricia said. It's appropriate. We moved to the Conservancy. Joan Holler had stayed in contact with Patricia's firm during the estate process, as Edmund had asked her to. The $620,000 offer was current and remained open, as Joan had stated in her letter. Patricia had run the number against comparable transactions and believed it was fair. Neither a windfall nor an underpayment, but an accurate valuation of the right's worth to that particular buyer for that particular purpose. There's one additional thing, Patricia said. Joan Holler mentioned in our last conversation that the Conservancy is interested in the mill property itself, not to purchase it, to partner on the restoration. I set down my coffee. They have a heritage sites program, Patricia said. that they run in conjunction with the Ohio Historic Preservation Office. For properties with both natural and historic significance, they provide technical assistance, grant writing, contractor referrals, project management support. The mill qualifies on both counts. It's on the creek they're restoring, and Dr. Farrow's survey establishes the historic significance. Edmund had not mentioned this in the letter. He might not have known about it. Or he might have known about it and left it for me to find, the way he had left other things, positioned not pushed. The latter at the deliberate angle. She wants to meet with me, I said. When you're ready. I thought about what I had said to Bess. I want to restore the mill. I had said it clearly, without preamble, the way you say things when you have finally arrived at them after a long approach. I'm ready, I said. Raymond came that afternoon. Not at my invitation. He simply came the way he had always moved through the world, on his own schedule and in the reasonable assumption that his arrival was not intrusive because he had never had cause to consider whether it might be. But he knocked, which he had not always done, and he waited, which was new. And when I opened the door he did not step in until I stepped back to indicate he could. Small things. The kind that accumulate in the other direction. I had made a decision about how to handle this conversation. I had made it after Patricia left and before I started dinner, sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the afternoon light on the east field. The decision was this. I was not going to perform equanimity I did not feel, and I was not going to hold on to resentment that would cost me more than it cost him. Both of those things were real options I had seen people take in situations like this, and both of them were wrong for the same reason, which was that they were about Raymond and not about me. I was tired of being about Raymond. I was going to be what Edmund had called for, clear. He sat in the chair he had sat in on his first visit, across the table. He had the same careful expression, the one that was trying to be composed and doing better at it than it had 3 days ago. Practice, maybe. Or decision. I spoke with my attorney today. I said. I figured. I'm going to grant you a water easement. I watched something move in his face. The beginning of relief, which he was trying not to show too early. The easement will acknowledge the senior status of the mill parcel's water right. It will include a compensation payment. And it will include a minimum flow provision coordinated with the Heron Creek Watershed Conservancy's restoration standards. The relief completed and then became something else. The Conservancy, he said. I'm moving forward with the Conservancy easement. The two are not in conflict. The minimum flow provision means that in dry years your irrigation draw will be constrained below a certain level. In most years it won't affect you. In a dry year it could. In a dry year you will have more notice than the alternative, which is operating without any formal water right at all. He looked at the table. He was running numbers in his head. I could see it in the way his jaw moved slightly, the way a man moves his jaw when he is doing arithmetic. 30 years of farming and he could run yield projections in his head the way my mother could price a lumber load by feel. What's the compensation? He said. $50,000 one time. He was still for a moment. Then he said, that's real money. Yes. For something that was an informal arrangement for 30 years. For something that was never formalized, which is a different thing. I kept my voice level. Not cold clear. Your father allowed the arrangement to remain informal because he was alive and the mill was his. He is no longer alive and the mill is no longer his. Raymond looked at the window. The east field was in the last of the afternoon light. The light going golden long the way it did in every season when the sun got low. The light I had been watching from this window for 38 years. He planned this, Raymond said. Not as an accusation now. As the completion of something he had been working toward since Monday. He did. For how long? 20 years from what I can understand. Maybe longer. Raymond said nothing for a while. I let the silence be what it was. Dad never, he stopped. Started again. I understood there was a distance between us. Toward the end. Not a falling out. Just a distance. I didn't know what it was about. He looked at the table. I thought it was age. The decline. People get private when they're dying. He wasn't private with me, I said. He was private about me. Raymond heard the difference. I watched him hear it. I know I wasn't. He stopped again. And I understood that he was not a man who had many words for what he was trying to say, and that the ones he had were not coming easily. I know I wasn't always toward you the way I should have been. This was as close as Raymond Whitfield was going to come to an apology in this kitchen on this day, and possibly ever. I knew this, and I did not need him to do more. I needed him to hear what I was about to say. Raymond, I said, I'm not looking for an accounting. I'm too old for that, and so are you. What I am looking for is a clear understanding going forward of what we each have and what we each need, and how those two things can be structured honestly. I paused. I would like the mill restored. That is what I intend to do with what Edmund left me. Not to hold it over anyone, because it is worth doing, and I am the one who is going to do it. He looked at me. Something in his face had shifted from the careful composure into something quieter. The expression of a man who is arriving at a revised understanding and does not yet know all of its implications. He left it to the right person, he said. It was the second time he had said something like that. The first had been at the door, to the door frame, not quite able to say it to my face. This time he was looking at me. He thought so, I said. Raymond nodded once. He stood up. Have your attorney send me the easement terms. I'll have mine review them. If the numbers are what you said, I don't expect there'll be significant negotiation. Good. The minimum flow provision. He said it carefully, working through the practicality of it. I'll need to understand how that's measured and who measures it. That'll be in the document. The Conservancy uses a monitoring station on the creek. The data is public. He nodded again. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, the same place he had stopped on Monday, he paused, and I waited, and he said without turning, the mill. The restoration. Is there anything? He stopped. Is there anything you need? I said, completing it for him, because he was not going to find the words on his own, and we were both too old to stand here until he did. Yes, he said. I thought about Edmund's letter. The mill structure. The foundation and the timber frame and the millstone in its frame. The plan Edmund had been building quietly for 20 years, in the knowledge that the people in his family who would have used the information were not the people he wanted to have it. You are. Not yet, I said. But I'll let you know. He went out. The truck engine started, and I listened to it go, and I did not feel the triumph I might have expected. I felt something quieter and more complicated. The particular sensation of a thing that has been held very tightly for a very long time beginning very slowly to be released. I called Joan Holler on a Friday in the second week of April, 10 days before planting began on the Whitfield farm acreage. I had been ready to call her for several days and had waited, not out of hesitation about the decision but out of the instinct Edmund had named. I did not want to rush. I wanted to make the call when I was ready to be in the conversation, not just to complete a step. Joan Holler had a voice that immediately communicated that she had been doing this work for a long time and believed in it, and was not going to perform enthusiasm she did not feel. She said, Nora Whitfield, Edmund told me about you. And then before I could respond, he said you would take your time. He said that was a good thing. I liked her immediately. We talked for nearly 2 hours, which was longer than I had expected and shorter than it felt. She explained the Heron Creek Restoration Project in the complete and specific terms of a person who understood it from the hydrology outward. The creek had been degraded over a century of agricultural modification. Straightening, tile drainage, riparian clearing. The restoration project was designed to address the primary degradation points over a 10-year period, working with landowners along the upper watershed. The senior water right attached to the Whitfield Mill was the critical piece, because it established minimum flows that would govern every other use on that stretch of the creek. Without it, the restoration framework was incomplete. Edmund held it for 18 months, I said. He did. He was very careful about the timing. He wanted to make sure the right was transferred under circumstances where you had the full context. She paused. He was protective of you in the specific way of someone who understood that you were walking into a situation without the information that had been kept from you, and who wanted to make sure you had what you needed before you had to use it. I sat with that. She told me about the mill. The Conservancy's Heritage Sites program was exactly what Patricia had described. Technical assistance, grant writing support, contractor referrals, project management guidance. For properties at the intersection of natural and historic significance, the program could provide substantial help navigating the restoration process. The National Register nomination, which Dr. Farrow's survey had determined the mill was eligible for, would unlock both the state preservation grant and the federal tax credit. Joan's program could assist with the nomination process. "Have you been inside the mill?" she asked. "Once. 2 weeks ago." The millstone and the gear assembly, Dr. Farrow mentioned in her report that they're largely intact. That's significant. Most surviving mill structures lost their machinery decades ago. The Whitfield Mill, having both the structure and the working components, even in their current condition, puts it in a very small category. I thought about the millstone in its frame, the great gray disc tilted slightly and still, patient, not going anywhere. "There's something I need to ask you," I said. "Go ahead." "The flooding. The creek shifted in 1964, and the low ground around the mill has never fully recovered. If the restoration project addresses the upper watershed hydrology, is there any expectation that the flooding situation at the mill would improve?" She was quiet for a moment in a way that suggested she was giving the question the real consideration it deserved. "It's not guaranteed," she said. "The creek's current channel is 60 years established, and creek channels develop their own stability over time. We wouldn't be redirecting it to the 1887 position. That's not how watershed restoration works. But some of the flooding around the mill is attributable to excess runoff from the degraded riparian zone upstream. Restoring vegetative buffers and reducing tile drainage impacts could moderate the water table in that area, particularly in average precipitation years. I won't promise you dry ground, but I think the situation would improve. Improve enough to make the lower floor accessible. Potentially. It would take time and it would require some engineering work on the mill's immediate perimeter as well. But yes, potentially. I thought about the main floor of the mill, the millstone and the gearworks and the meal chest. The elevated platform Edmund's grandfather had built on the sandstone foundation, sitting 3 feet above the surrounding ground. The boards that had stayed sound above the flood line for 60 years. "I want to go ahead," I said, "with the Conservancy easement and with the Heritage Sites program." "Good," she said, in the straightforward manner of a person who has been waiting for something for a reasonable length of time and is prepared to begin. "Can you come to the mill next week? I'd like to walk the property with you and Dr. Farrow. She's expressed interest in participating in the restoration planning." I said I could. We set a date and she gave me her direct number and told me to call if anything came up before then, and I understood from the way she said it that she meant anything at all, not just logistical matters. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. It was a Friday evening in early April and the fields outside the kitchen window were beginning to show the first color, the pale greening that comes before the real green in Knox County, the color that is almost gray and almost green and is its own particular shade of early spring. I had watched this color come up through this window for 38 years and had never stopped noticing it, which was the particular gift of paying attention to the same thing over a long period. You never stopped seeing it. I thought about Clarence Whitfield in 1887, laying sandstone on the bank of Heron Creek in the certainty that what he built would be worth building. I thought about Edmund at the mill in the last year he could drive himself, climbing the ladder and cleaning the upper room, leaning the ladder at the deliberate angle of placement rather than storage. I thought about the masking tape on the key with my name in his handwriting. I thought about what it meant to restore something. Not to return it to what it was. You could not do that, not really, not with a building or a person or a relationship, but to bring it forward. To take what had survived and build from it something that could be used again. That was different from preservation, which was about keeping. Restoration was about continuing. The mill had been waiting to continue for 60 years. I drove out to the mill on a Sunday alone, in the gray-green of early April. I had proper boots this time. I parked in the clearing and sat in the car for a moment looking at the structure in the afternoon light. It was still standing. I had somehow expected, every time I came here, to find it changed. As though the act of knowing its significance had made it more fragile. But it was exactly as I had left it. The sandstone foundation and the weathered siding and the timber frame intact along every visible line. The structure of a thing built by a man who understood that if you built it right it would outlast the reasons you had for building it. I walked to the door with my boots sinking only slightly in the soft ground, The saturated ground of early April not yet at its worst. I unlocked the padlock, the brass key worn smooth, my name on the tape, and stepped inside. I had brought the shop lamp's extension cord from the generator. I had brought a legal pad and 3 pens and Edmund's mill history book, which I had found on the shelf in his study 2 weeks after the funeral and had been reading slowly ever since. I started the generator outside and ran the cord up the ladder and plugged in the lamp, and the upper room filled with the same clean yellow light I had seen on the night of the letter. I sat at the workbench on the shop stool. The metal box was where I had left it. I had retrieved the accordion folder earlier in the week for Patricia and had returned everything afterward, setting the combination lock back to 1887 out of habit or out of respect. I was not sure which. I opened the mill history book to the chapter on the Heron Creek Mills. Edmund had turned down the corner of a page. Not something he did habitually. Most of his books were unmarked, cared for. This corner was the only fold in the book. I turned to it. The passage on the folded page described the period between 1900 and 1920 as the peak of the Knox County milling industry, when the region's farms had reached their greatest extent and the mill operators had prospered along with the agricultural economy. The Whitfield Mill was mentioned specifically as one of the most productive mills on the upper watershed, processing grain for a radius of 20 miles. There was a description of the millstone, Ohio sandstone, quarried from the local formation, 6 feet in diameter, the standard size for a mill of that output, and a brief mention of the miller's practice of holding community harvest meals in the mill's lower floor in the weeks before Christmas, when the main processing season had ended and the space could be cleared. I set the book on the workbench and looked at the page for a while. Community harvest meals. The lower floor cleared. The millstone at rest in its frame for the season, the gearwork still, the meal chest empty. The farm families of Knox County eating together in the space that had spent the year working for them. I had not known about this. Edmund might have. He had read this book many times. I picked up the legal pad. At the top of the first page I wrote Restoration Plan. First draft. I sat with that for a moment. Then below it I began to write. The water right to the Conservancy. The Heritage Sites Program. The National Register nomination. Dr. Farrow's survey as the foundation for the nomination application. Patricia handling the legal documentation. Joan handling the technical coordination. Then the physical restoration itself, in the order that Edmund's letter and Dr. Farrow's report and my own reading had suggested. Foundation assessment, then structural reinforcement of the south wall, then interior, then the millstone and gear works. Not all at once. In sequence. The way you restore anything that has been standing for a long time. Carefully attending to what you find as you find it, not committed to a fixed outcome but committed to the process. The grant. $75,000 for stabilization from the State Preservation Program, if the National Register nomination was approved. The federal tax credit on rehabilitation expenditure. Patricia had explained how the credit worked, and it was more usable than I had expected. The Conservancy money. $620,000. I had been careful about that number. I had not let myself plan from it freely because I had spent a lifetime understanding money as something that is not guaranteed until it arrives, and because large numbers in a document and large numbers in a bank account are different things, and because I knew that some part of my caution was simply the habit of a woman who had grown up pricing lumber and understood at her bones what things actually cost and what they did not. But I was alone in this upper room in the early April light with a legal pad and Edmund's book in the creek moving below, and I let myself think about it. The restoration itself, the full restoration, not the stabilization phase but the complete bringing forward of the mill to a functional state. Patricia had told me to expect significant cost. Timber frame restoration at historic mills was specialized work, not general contracting. The millworks would require a millwright, a profession that was genuinely rare and therefore genuinely expensive. The foundation work, especially with the flooding complication, would need engineering. She had offered a rough range, between $150,000 and $250,000, depending on scope and findings. A wide range because until the structural assessment was complete, the findings were unknown. That left, if the Conservancy transaction proceeded cleanly, for $100,000 or more. I held my pen above the legal pad for a while. I had not had $400,000 in my life. I had not had the expectation of it, the habit of it, the particular kind of thinking that comes from having resources of that magnitude available. I was 67 years old and I had lived carefully and well inside the means I had. And the means I had would not have suggested any such number. Edmund had said, "I know this is more than you expected." It was considerably more than I had expected. I wrote on the legal pad, "What do I actually need?" Below that I wrote, "To live on. To restore the mill. To do both with room to breathe." The farmhouse was mine. The property taxes on the mill parcel were mine, which were small. My monthly needs were modest in the way of a person who had never developed expensive habits and had no intention of starting. The restoration would cost what it cost, and the grant and tax credit would offset a portion. The number left over after all of it was still more than I had ever had or expected. I sat with that for a while and tried to be honest with myself about what to do with it. I thought about the community harvest meals in the mill's lower floor. I thought about what Edmund had said about the mill, the best piece of land in this whole estate. He had not meant it only in terms of the water right. He had known what the mill was in the history of this county, what it had meant to the farms and the families that had brought their grain here for 77 years. He had known what it could be again. Not just a restored historic building. Not just a heritage site. Something that continued what it had been. A gathering place. A working place. A place connected to the land and the people on it. I wrote slowly the beginnings of a longer plan. By the time I climbed back down the ladder and locked the padlock and walked back to my car in the early April dusk, the legal pad had 12 pages of notes. Some of them were practical. Some of them were speculative. Some of them were the kind of thinking that surprised you, that arrived from a direction you had not known you were looking. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the mill in the last light. 60 years it had been standing here. Raymond had called it a swamp. The county had valued it at $11,000. Edmund's father had given up on it. Edmund himself had let it stand empty for 30 years before he started coming back here alone, when he could still drive, to clean the upper room and change the lock and lean a ladder at the precise angle of someone laying a path. I thought about the way the history book had described the millstone. Ohio sandstone, quarried from the local formation. The local formation. The same stone that made up the foundation Clarence Whitfield had laid in 1887. Stone from this county's own ground, quarried by men from this county, shaped and placed by hands that understood what the work was for. That was the thing about this county, about these fields and this creek and this history. It was not separate from the people who lived in it. It was made by them and it made them, and the connection ran in both directions, quiet and unhurried, the way the creek ran over its stones in the dark. I had come into this county at 27 years old in my mother's altered dress, and I had spent 38 years learning it the way you learn anything you love, through long, slow noticing. I had earned the right to restore it. Not legally, the law was clear about that, but in the other sense. In the sense of knowing what it was. I started the car. I drove back through the two-rut track, the scrub growth pressing in on both sides, the last of the daylight going gray-gold at the edges the way April light goes in Ohio when the sun gets low. At home I called Bess. She answered on the second ring. "I know what I'm going to do with it," I said. "Tell me," she said. I did. All of it. The restoration plan and the conservancy partnership and the National Register nomination and the number I had been careful not to plan from and the pages of notes on the legal pad and the passage in Edmund's book about the community harvest meals in the lower floor. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was paying full attention and the thing she was paying attention to had landed. "Edmund," she said. "Edmund," I said. "He built the plan," she said. "But you built what comes next." I looked out the kitchen window at the east field in the dark. The field Raymond would begin planting in 10 days. With the water the easement would formalize, the water that had always been there, that had always run in the creek beside the mill that Clarence Whitfield built in 1887 from local stone laid by local hands for the local purpose of turning grain into something people could use. "I'm going to need your help," I said. "I know," Bess said. "That's why I answered." Outside, the April dark was full and complete and the field was invisible and the creek, somewhere beyond the scrub line, was running. I could not hear it from here. But I knew it was running. It had always been running. I had simply, finally, been given the conditions to listen. Joan Holler drove a truck, which I had not expected and then immediately understood. You did not spend 20 years walking creek banks and pushing through riparian brush in a sedan. She pulled into the mill clearing on the Wednesday morning we had arranged, a mud-spattered gray pickup with a topographic map tube visible behind the seat and a pair of waders rolled over the tailgate. She was in her late 40s, tall, with the economical movements of someone who covered a lot of ground on foot and had made peace with the pace that required. Dr. Inez Farrow arrived 10 minutes later in a smaller car, carrying a canvas bag that clinked when she set it down, the sound of measuring instruments. She was younger than I had pictured her from the survey report, early 40s maybe, with the specific alertness of an academic who has learned to look at physical things and not just ideas about them. She shook my hand and immediately turned to look at the mill with the expression of someone returning to a place they have been thinking about. We stood in the clearing for a few minutes, the three of us looking at it together. The April morning was cool and the creek was audible from where we stood, running higher than it would be by June, carrying the spring runoff. A red-winged blackbird called from somewhere in the scrub and then was quiet. Joan spoke first. "The south wall," she said. Not a question. She had been here before, as part of the original Conservancy assessment. "Dr. Farrow's report says it's the most compromised," I said. "The flooding comes from the southeast and high water events. The creek is running east of the building now, but in a significant rain event the low ground on the south side backs up against the wall." She looked at the high water line, the horizontal stripe of discoloration running 4 feet from the ground. The stone foundation is holding that water back, which is why the floor is elevated. But the south wall base is the chronic wet point. Inez Farrow had taken a small notebook from her bag and was writing. Not looking at the notebook while she wrote, looking at the mill and writing the way people write when they have done a great deal of field documentation and the notation has become automatic. I unlocked the padlock and we went inside. The main floor in April was different from what it had been in March. The light was different, higher and more direct through the gaps in the siding, and the smell was different, the mineral cold of the stone less sharp now, the wood smell more present as the interior warmed slightly with the season. The millstone was exactly where it had been. The great gray disc tilted in its frame, patient and permanent. Joan went directly to the south wall and crouched at the base, pressing her hand against the lower boards. She was assessing moisture content by touch, which I had seen Edmund do with fence posts and knew meant something to someone who understood wood. Inez was photographing the millstone from 3 angles. She moved around it with a deliberateness that was nearly ceremonial, which I did not think she was doing intentionally but which felt right. "The stone is Knox County sandstone," she said, not stopping the photography. "Same formation as the foundation. Clarence Whitfield quarried both from the same source, almost certainly. You can see it in the color, that particular warm gray. It's distinctive." She lowered the camera and looked at it directly. "There are 4 operating gristmill museums in Ohio. None of them have a millstone of this size in original placement. Most were moved for preservation or removed entirely. This one has been sitting in this frame for 137 years. She said it the way you say a number that has weight, not for effect but because the weight is real. I climbed the ladder first and connected the extension cord to the generator. The lamp came on and the upper room appeared in its clean yellow light. The workbench, the stool, the metal box, the 2 windows letting in pale rectangles of April morning. Joan and Inez came up separately, each taking the ladder with the same careful attention, testing the rungs. In the upper room they stood together for a moment, and I watched them do what I had done on my first night here. Look at the evidence of what Edmund had arranged. The cleanliness of the floor. The position stool. The lamp and the orange extension cord. "He maintained this room," Inez said. "For years, from what I can tell. He knew what he had." She walked to the north window and looked out. From here the view was the scrub woods screening the mill from the county road, and above them the open sky. The survey I conducted 14 months ago. He was very precise about what he wanted me to assess. He had questions about the structural integrity that suggested he had been observing the building for a long time. Not casually. Systematically. Joan had unrolled a topographic map on the workbench. She smoothed it with both hands and oriented it to the north wall. "I want to show you something," she said. I stood beside her. The map showed the Heron Creek watershed from the county line to the point where the creek joined a larger drainage system some miles to the south. The Whitfield Mill property was marked with a small square at a bend in the creek's current channel. Upstream from the mill, Joan traced the creek's course with one finger. "This section," she said, pointing to a half-mile stretch of creek about 3/4 of a mile upstream, "is where the worst of the riparian degradation is. A tile drainage system installed in the 50s directed agricultural runoff directly into the creek at this point, and the volume and velocity of that input is partly what shifted the channel downstream in 1964. The creek straightened itself in response to the hydrological pressure." She moved her finger to the channel bend by the mill. "The 1887 channel ran approximately here." She indicated a line about 15 feet west of the current channel marker. I looked at the distance between the old and new channel positions. "If the restoration addresses the upstream input," I said, "the pressure on the lower channel decreases." "Correct. We can't guarantee channel migration and we wouldn't try to engineer it. The creek will find its own equilibrium over time. But reduced hydraulic pressure upstream generally means reduced energy in the channel downstream. Over 5 to 10 years, the lower channel typically moderates." She looked at me. "The flooding at the mill would not disappear. But the frequency and depth of the worst events would likely decrease." "Likely," I said. "Hydrology is not a precise science where individual properties are concerned. I want to be honest about that." I appreciated it. Edmund had told me to trust my own judgment. Part of my judgment was that people who named their uncertainties were more reliable than people who didn't. "The restoration project timeline," I said. "Walk me through the sequence." Joan took me through it with the same systematic care she had shown with the map. The Conservancy's work would begin on the upstream degradation point in the fall, following the water right transfer, and the associated regulatory approvals. The riparian buffer restoration, planting native vegetation along the creek banks to slow runoff and filter sediment, would follow in the spring of the next year. Monitoring of downstream water levels would begin immediately and continue throughout the project. The mill property itself was adjacent to but distinct from the Conservancy's restoration work. What the Heritage Sites program would provide was support for the mill's own restoration process. A structural engineer experienced in historic mill buildings, a contact with one of the 3 remaining practicing millwrights in Ohio, assistance with the National Register nomination, and grant application support. The program did not fund the restoration directly, but it provided the scaffolding around the funding that the property owner would need to secure. "The National Register nomination," Ines said, from the north window where she had been quietly taking notes. "My survey report is the foundation for it, but the nomination itself is a separate document. I can prepare it with your cooperation. I'd want to do additional interior documentation of the millworks before I finalize it." "When can you do that?" "I could come back with a full documentation kit in 2 weeks. It would take a full day. Possibly 2. She paused. "I want to document the millstone in particular before any restoration work begins, in case the work disturbs its current position. The placement is historically significant and I want a complete record." I told her 2 weeks was fine and we agreed on a date. Joan rolled up the map. "There's one more thing I want to show you," she said. "Outside." We came down the ladder and out through the south door. Joan led us around the east side of the building, past the corner of the foundation, to the margin of soft ground between the mill and Heron Creek. The creek was 30 feet away and visible through the sedge grass, moving dark and fast with the spring runoff. Between the creek and the foundation corner, Joan stopped. She looked at the ground for a moment and then looked up at the southeast corner of the millstone foundation. "There," she said. I looked where she was indicating. At the southeast foundation corner at ground level, there was a feature I had not noticed on my first visit. A low stone channel roughly 2 feet wide and perhaps 18 inches deep, running from the base of the foundation outward toward the creek. It was partially silted and overgrown with sedge grass, but the stone-lined form of it was visible if you knew where to look. "That's the original tail race," Ines said from beside me. She had already recognized it. "The water wheel was on the east face of the building. You can see where the wheel pit was in the foundation, that rectangular void. The water came in from the creek via a head race on the north side, turned the wheel, and drained back to the creek through this channel." "It's still intact?" I said. Joan crouched at the near end of the channel and cleared sedge grass with her hand. The stone lining was solid. "The silting has actually protected it." This is the original 1887 construction. She stood. When Clarence Whitfield built this mill, he designed the water management into the foundation. The channel grades properly. I checked when I was here for the initial assessment. It still drains. I stood at the southeast corner of a building that had been built 137 years ago by a man I had never met, who had quarried stone from the local formation and designed a drainage channel that still worked, and I felt the particular quality of being located in time that comes when the past makes contact with the present through something physical, something you can crouch beside and clear sedge grass from with your hand. He built it to last, I said. He built it to work, Joan said. Which is different. Things built only to last get preserved. Things built to work get restored. Patricia sent the easement draft to Raymond's attorney on a Thursday in the third week of April. It was precise and complete and included everything we had discussed. The acknowledgement of the mill parcel's senior water right, the minimum flow provision keyed to the Conservancy's restoration monitoring standards, and the compensation figure of $50,000. Raymond's attorney, a man named Holt who had been handling Whitfield farm matters for 15 years, sent back a single page of questions that were, Patricia said, reasonable questions rather than negotiating positions. Which meant Raymond had told Holt to review and respond honestly, not to find room. The check arrived in the first week of May, before planting began. I held it for a moment before I deposited it. A check from Raymond Whitfield for $50,000, made out to Nora Louise Whitfield, the memo line reading, Water Easement, Whitfield Mill Parcel. Raymond's signature at the bottom, the signature of a man who had spent 30 years signing documents with the authority of someone whose name on a document settled the matter. His name had settled this matter too. Only the matter had changed. I deposited it and then I drove to the cemetery where Edmund was buried and where Daniel was buried, and I stood at both graves for a while in the early May morning with the birds moving in the trees above the stones, and I said what I needed to say, which I am not going to write here, because some things belong to the person saying them and the person being said to, and no one else. The Conservancy transaction closed in June. Patricia and Joan had worked through the spring on the documentation, the title work, the regulatory notifications, the formal transfer of the water right from the mill parcel to the Conservancy's stewardship. It was more paperwork than I had expected, which was Patricia's mild joke when I said so. Water rights transactions always are. The State Water Authority had to be notified. The Knox County Recorder's Office recorded the new instrument. The Conservancy filed the formal restoration plan with the relevant agencies. On the day the transaction closed, Joan Holler drove out to the mill and walked the tailrace channel with me for what she said was a tradition she had started 10 years ago, marking significant conservation milestones by walking the land they concerned. We walked from the foundation corner to the creek and stood at the point where the tailrace had once discharged Heron Creek water back into Heron Creek after it had turned the wheel and ground the grain. The creek ran past us, fast and dark in the June morning, indifferent to what we had just done and what it would mean for the watershed over the next decade. Joan looked at the creek for a while. Then she said, "The upstream work begins in September." "I know. By this time next year, you may see some change in the low ground." She gestured toward the soft margin between the mill and the creek. "Not dramatic, but measurable." The Conservancy check had cleared the week before. $620,000, deposited into an account I had opened specifically for the restoration project on Patricia's recommendation, to keep it separate from my household accounts and trackable for the tax credit purposes. Sitting in that account, it was still a number that felt more abstract than real. I had spent a good deal of time in the past 2 months trying to make it feel real, which was proving to be a slower process than I expected for someone who grew up understanding money with careful attention. Patricia had told me, the realness of it will come with the spending. When you write the first restoration check, it will become real. She was right about most things. "I want to ask you something," I said to Joan. She turned from the creek. "The Heritage Sites Program, the technical assistance, the contractor referrals. Is there a limit on the scope of what the program supports?" "In terms of the restoration work itself, no. The program scales to the project. For a property of this historic significance, the support would be substantial." She watched me. "What are you thinking about?" I had been thinking about it since the April morning in the upper room with the legal pad. I had written it down on page 9 of the notes and then gone back to it several times over the following weeks, adding to it and refining it, testing it against the practicalities as I came to understand them better. I want the mill to be operational, I said. Not as a museum. As a working mill. Joan was quiet for a moment. Not at historic scale, I said. I'm not talking about grinding grain for a 20-mile radius. But the millstone works. The gear assembly, the millwright I spoke with on the phone said, from Dr. Farrow's photographs, that it's more intact than he expected and the core mechanism may be restorable. If the water management can be addressed enough to stabilize the building and reduce the flooding, and if the wheel pit can be made functional again, you want to run water through it, Joan said. I want it to work. She looked at the tailrace channel at our feet. She looked at the creek. She had the expression of someone running through a set of calculations that were not purely financial, that included variables of feasibility and precedent and something harder to name. There are 2 working water-powered gristmills in Ohio, she said. Both are state park heritage sites with full-time mill operations staff. I know. I looked them up. The water management for a functioning mill is substantially more complex than for a preserved structure. You'd need to restore the headrace as well as the tailrace. You'd need a functional wheel. And the original wheel is gone, it's been gone since the 60s. You'd need a millwright not just for the gear assessment but for ongoing operation. I know all of that. She looked at me. You've done your homework. Edmund left me a plan, I said. I've been adding to it. She was quiet for another moment, looking at the creek. Then she said, if the mill is operational, even at limited capacity, it changes the Heritage Sites program support significantly. An operating historic mill is eligible for programming grants that a preserved structure isn't. Educational partnerships, agricultural heritage programming, demonstration grants. The funding landscape is different for something that works. That's what I thought, I said. But I wanted to hear it from you. Joan looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as her version of approval, which was not effusive and was therefore more reliable. The program can support this, she said. It will take longer than a standard preservation project. The engineering complexity is significant. And you'll need to find a millwright who is willing to take on a project at this scale. The one I spoke with is in Licking County. He said to call him when I had a structural assessment in hand. She smiled. It was not a large smile, but it was real. You've already called him. He came recommended by Dr. Farrow. Joan looked out at the creek one more time. The June light on the water was different from the March dark in the April morning. It was high and warm and the creek was already dropping from the spring peak, running cleaner now, the color of old glass. A kingfisher crossed from the far bank and disappeared into the scrub on the near side. Let's get the structural assessment scheduled, she said. And then we'll build the plan from what we find. The structural engineer Joan referred me to was a woman named Carol Vasquez, who had spent 15 years working specifically on historic timber frame buildings in the Ohio River watershed, and who arrived at the mill on a Tuesday in July with a moisture meter and a mallet and a set of plans she had drawn up from Dr. Farrow's survey photographs. She was methodical in a way that was satisfying to watch. She moved through the building in a systematic grid, testing each timber with the mallet, recording the meter readings on a clipboard, making notes in a shorthand I could not read but that she translated for me as she went. The news was better than I had budgeted for, emotionally if not financially. The timber frame was sound on the upper story. All of it. Edmund's roof repairs had kept the upper timbers dry, and dry timbers in a well-constructed frame maintain their integrity over a very long period. The lower story was more complicated. 6 timbers in the south wall showed significant moisture damage and would need to be sistered or replaced, and 2 of the floor joists in the southwest quadrant had deteriorated beyond saving. But the primary structural posts and beams, the skeleton of the thing, were holding. The foundation was what Carol spent the most time on. She tapped it section by section, read the meter against the stone at multiple heights, crouched at the tailrace opening and shone a light into the channel. She was thorough in the way of someone who understood that foundation findings determined everything that followed. The northeast and northwest corners are excellent, she said, straightening from a crouch at the north wall. The southeast corner, the wet corner, shows some mortar erosion in the lower 2 courses. Not structural failure. Chronic moisture has leached the original lime mortar. She made a note. Repointing with hydraulic lime mortar. and establishing better drainage at the foundation perimeter would address it. Not inexpensive but not catastrophic. And the wheel pit, I said. We were on the east face of the building now, standing at the rectangular void in the foundation where the water wheel had once been mounted. Carol crouched at the pit opening and looked in with her light. She was in there for a long time. When she came out she had mortar dust on her jacket, and an expression that was carefully neutral. The pit is structurally intact, she said. The stone lining is original and the mortar is in better condition than the southeast corner. The pit geometry actually sheds water more efficiently than the flat south wall. The axle mounts are still present. She stood and brushed off her jacket. You could mount a wheel in this pit. It would take engineering work to design the modern mounting to the historic axle positions, but the pit itself is sound. I said nothing for a moment. I want to be clear, Carol said. That mounting a functional wheel and running water through the headrace is a significant engineering undertaking that goes well beyond structural restoration. I can design the structural work. The hydraulic engineering for an operating mill is a separate specialty. I know. Joan is making a referral. Carol nodded. She had worked with Joan before. They had that easy professional shorthand of people who have been on the same job sites. One more thing. She looked up at the roofline. The roof Edmund repaired is holding, but the original cedar shingles he used are at the end of their serviceable life. Within 3 to 5 years you'll have water infiltration in the upper story. I'd recommend replacing the roof in the first phase of work, before any interior restoration, to protect what's already sound. Put it in the assessment. She did. The full written assessment arrived 2 weeks later, 12 pages with photographs and annotated diagrams, and a cost estimate for the structural stabilization phase that came in at $83,000. Within the range Patricia had projected. Within what the preservation grant, pending the National Register nomination, would significantly offset. I read the assessment at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening with the windows open to the July dark, and the sound of the fields and a glass of wine I had poured, and then not touched because I had been too absorbed in the reading to remember it was there. When I finished, I closed the document and looked at the window for a while. The plan was becoming real in the way Patricia had said it would. Not through the money arriving but through the spending being understood. Each piece of it was becoming specific. This timber, this corner, this pit, this roof. The mill was becoming not a symbol of something Edmund had seen and I had inherited but an actual building with actual problems that had actual solutions that cost actual amounts of money and would take actual time. I was not frightened by this. I want to say that clearly because there was a version of me a year ago who might have been. The Nora who sat in that conference room with her hands folded in her lap giving nothing away was also a Nora who had spent 38 years making her peace with the fact that the large decisions were not hers to make. And that kind of peace, even when it is real, leaves marks. You can mistake the marks for your own character if you are not careful. You can come to believe you are a person who watches rather than a person who acts, when actually you are a person who was not given much to act on and made the best of it. Edmund had given me something to act on. I was not frightened. I was, in a way I had not felt since Daniel was alive and the farm was good and the days had the particular quality of days that are full of the right kind of work. I was interested. Bess came for dinner in August, the way she had been coming once a week since March, and we ate on the porch because the August evenings in Knox County are the best evenings of the year, warm without the weight of July, the fields going gold and the light staying late. I had made the apple tart. The Jonathans were not yet ripe. They came in late September. But the Gravensteins along the fence came in August and they were good for a tart if you added a little more sugar than you thought you needed. She brought her reading glasses and the copy of Carol's structural assessment that I had given her, and she had marked it up in pencil in the margins in the way she marked up everything she read, which was thoroughly and with an educator's habit of questioning the assumptions behind a stated conclusion. She had questions about the moisture meter readings on the south wall timbers, which were fair questions, and about the timeline Carol had projected for the roof work, which she thought was optimistic given the contractor availability in the county. Both were things I had already asked Carol about and had answers for, and we went through them over the tart and the last of the evening light. When the questions were done, Bess set the document on the porch railing and looked out at the east field. "Gerald called me," she said. I looked at her. "Gerald Whitfield. He said he didn't have your current phone number." She paused. "He has your number, Nora. He's had it for 30 years. I know. He wanted to know if the restoration project was something that family members might be able to participate in. His words. I set down my fork. What did you tell him? That I'd pass it along. She looked at me steadily. He sounded genuinely interested. Not the way Raymond sounded interested in a water easement. Actually interested. Gerald Whitfield was the Whitfield I knew least well, which was partly distance. He had been in Columbus for 30 years with his accounting practice, and partly the way families distribute their attention, which tends to concentrate around the people who demand it and pass over the quieter ones. Gerald had sat at the conference room table and looked at the surface in front of him when Raymond laughed and Claudette pressed her lips. He had not laughed. He had not joined. He had also not said anything, which was its own kind of choosing, but it was a different kind. I thought about Edmund's letter. Gerald had received Edmund's savings and investments. $182,000, a meaningful but not transformative sum. The kind that acknowledged a son without making a statement. Edmund had been deliberate about everything in that will. The amounts and the destinations had all meant something. What kind of participation? I said. He didn't specify. He said he had some accounting background in nonprofit structures and historic preservation funding, from a client he'd worked with years ago. He thought it might be relevant. I looked at the east field. The light was almost gone, the gold gone to gray, the way Knox County evenings go in August when the sun drops below the tree line. Gerald had accounting expertise in nonprofit structures and historic preservation funding. Edmund had left me the mill and a plan and told me to trust my own judgment. He had not said to do everything alone. Tell him to call me, I said. Bess nodded once, satisfied, and picked up her fork. The mill is going to need a structure around it, I said. Not just a building. Something that holds the programming, the education work, the ongoing operation. Patricia mentioned a nonprofit framework but said the governance design was something I'd need to think through. And Gerald knows that landscape. Apparently. Bess ate her tart and looked at the darkening field. Edmund wanted the family to come to you, she said. He wrote it in the letter. He did. He just didn't specify which ones. No, I said. He left that to me. The August dark was coming on fully now, the field gone invisible, the first stars showing above the tree line to the east. A whippoorwill started up somewhere in the scrub along the creek boundary, the sound of it carrying clearly in the still air, the way sounds carry in Knox County in the late summer evenings when the heat has broken and the air is finally still. I had lived through 38 Knox County summers at this table and this porch and this view. I had listened to this particular bird in this particular dark in August for a long time. I had never had reason to think of it as mine specifically, the way you think of things that belong to you. The farm had belonged to the Whitfields and I had belonged to Daniel, and the whole arrangement had been clear about what was what. Now the farm was Raymond's and I was nobody's, which meant I was finally specifically my own. And the mill was mine and the plan was mine and the structure around it would be mine to build with the people I chose in the time I had. The whippoorwill called again. I listened to it. I need to tell you something, I said to Bess. She looked at me. I've been thinking about what happens after the restoration. Not just the operational mill, the larger thing. The harvest meals. She knew what I meant. I had told her about the passage in Edmund's history book. The lower floor, she said, cleared. In the weeks after harvest. Farm families from the county, the way it was done for 77 years before the creek shifted and the mill went quiet. I looked at the dark field. Not a reenactment. Something real. The mill will be grinding grain from Knox County farms. There's a heritage grain movement, I've been reading about it, farmers growing older varieties of wheat and corn, the kinds of things these mills were built to process. Some of them are 20 miles from here. You've already looked into the grain. I've talked to one farmer. His name is Marcus Webb. He grows an heirloom corn variety his grandfather grew. He's been looking for a local mill for 3 years. I paused. He cried a little on the phone. He didn't think I noticed, but I noticed. Bess looked at me with the expression I had seen on her face on the April morning when I said I want to restore the mill. The expression of someone watching something arrive at its right destination. Edmund saw this, she said. The whole of it. The water right and the conservation and the grant and the mill working and the harvest meals. He saw it or he trusted me to see it. I said. I'm not sure which. Maybe he thought they were the same thing. Bess was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are they? I thought about the upper room and the lamp and the stool and the combination set to 1887. I thought about the ladder at the deliberate angle. I thought about the line at the bottom of the 4-page letter. You were the right one for this family, Nora. Even when we weren't the right family for you. I think he saw the mill, I said. And he saw me. And he understood that a person and a place can need the same thing at the same time. And that if you give them to each other, something happens that neither of them could have done alone. The whippoorwill called. The dark was complete. The field was invisible, the creek was invisible, the mill was invisible 2 miles down the county road in its clearing by the water, standing the way it had been standing for 137 years, patient, not going anywhere, waiting for the conditions that would let it continue. I had been patient too. For a long time. For longer than I knew. The conditions had arrived. In the morning I would call Gerald Whitfield. I would call Marcus Webb. I would call the hydraulic engineer Joan had referred me to and schedule the wheel pit assessment. I would call Patricia and begin the non-profit structure conversation. In the morning there was a great deal to do, and I was for the first time in a long time fully prepared to do it. Tonight I sat on the porch with Bess and listened to the whippoorwill and let the dark be dark and the field be field and the creek be running, which it was, which it had always been, which it would be still when the wheel was turning and the stone was moving and the grain of Knox County was becoming something people could use. I had earned this too. The sitting still. The listening. Tomorrow was going to be a long and necessary day, and I was ready for it, and tonight I was here in the August dark, in the county I had come to at 27 years old and learned the way you learn anything you love, through long slow noticing. I noticed everything. I always had. Nobody had asked me to. Nobody needed to. That was finally enough. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying. But it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours, and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.